When the marble temples of Rome caught the golden light of dawn, they stood as monuments to gods who demanded not just prayers, but passions. In that world, where incense curled into the morning air and statues of Venus and Priapus gleamed in the firelight, the line between the sacred and the profane was never clear. Desire was not a private sin. It was a force of nature, worshipped, feared, and ultimately sanctified. The Romans did not see lust as shame, they saw it as the pulse of creation itself. To them, the act of love was not merely human indulgence but a reenactment of the divine energy that made life possible. It is within this strange and haunting paradox that one of Rome's most shocking institutions was born, the sacred prostitute. She was not a courtesan in the common sense, nor merely a woman selling her body for survival. In the eyes of those who knelt before her, she was an intermediary between mortals and gods, her touch a prayer, her body an offering. The temple of Venus Erycina on the slopes of Mount Eryx was said to house such women, priestesses of pleasure, who turned lust into liturgy. Yet to modern eyes, this mingling of holiness and desire feels both mesmerizing and disturbing. How could an empire that celebrated law, honor, and virtue also elevate prostitution to divine ritual? To understand, we must enter the Roman mind. A civilization that believed everything, from birth to death, was guided by divine will. Sex, like war and commerce, had its gods and its ceremonies. Venus governed love, Fortuna controlled fate, and Liber, the god of freedom, presided over fertility and drunken ecstasy. To worship them was to embrace life's most primal forces, and that included the carnal. A Roman might visit a temple not to confess a sin, but to ask the goddess for fertility, for luck in love, or even for healing through sensual touch. Pleasure, in their theology, could be a form of prayer. Yet beneath this beauty lay a darker reality. Rome was a city of contradictions, a place where the same people who adored the goddess of love also enslaved women to serve in brothels, where the same rituals that exalted desire also exploited it. The sacred prostitute stood at the crossroads of holiness and humiliation, adored and degraded, free in the eyes of the gods but bound by the desires of men. Her sanctity was both divine and tragic. The Romans saw in her body the living symbol of their god's power, but few saw the human beneath the veil. In the flickering light of oil lamps, men whispered prayers as they reached out to touch what they believed was divine flesh. The temple bells rang softly, signaling not sin, but salvation through pleasure. This was a world where faith and flesh were inseparable, where devotion meant surrender, and ecstasy could lead to enlightenment. For the Romans, the temple prostitute was a living mystery, a woman who stood on the threshold of heaven and earth, her body the altar on which mortals met their gods. But what made this faith possible? How did a culture that condemned adultery and prized marital virtue also celebrate lust as holy? How did the language of worship and desire become one and the same? To answer these questions, we must peel back the marble layers of Roman morality and look beneath, into the shadows where economics, religion, and desire merged into something both transcendent and terrifying. The story of how Roman prostitutes became sacred offerings to the gods of lust is not merely a tale of sex or sin. It is a story about power, divine, social, and psychological. It reveals how civilizations turn their deepest taboos into tools of control, how religion can sanctify the forbidden, and how desire, once named holy, can enslave those who embody it. Beneath the grandeur of Rome's temples and the poetry of its rituals lies a truth both uncomfortable and eternal. Humanity has always sought the divine through the body, and in that search, has blurred the line between worship and violation. As the camera moves through ancient ruins, broken pillars, faded frescoes of naked lovers, the hollow eyes of marble gods, the narration slows. These stones remember. They remember the women who stood before the altars, who offered their bodies in devotion, who carried both the holiness of Venus and the burden of man's hunger. Their names are lost, but their purpose echoes still. In Rome, desire was never just an act. It was a covenant with the divine, a sacred sin, a holy crime, and the empire's most enduring paradox. Beneath the marble glow of Rome's grandeur, far from the Senate halls and triumphal arches, another empire thrived, An empire built not on legions and law, but on flesh and desire. It began at dusk, when the city's patricians left their forums and the commoners returned from labor. As the streets darkened and torches flickered to life, whispers of laughter, the clink of coin, and the perfume of incense marked the awakening of Rome's hidden economy, the trade of pleasure. In this world, prostitution was not simply tolerated, it was structured, taxed, and codified. The Roman state understood that lust could be governed like grain or gold. Every prostitute, from the lowliest streetwalker to the courtesan of emperors, was required to register her name with the aedile, the city magistrate responsible for public morals. Her name, age, and chosen profession were inscribed in ledgers, a permanent mark that separated her from respectable matrons. She could not marry, she could not inherit, and she could never reclaim the title of honesta femina. Yet paradoxically, she was vital to the city's moral balance, an outlet for men's desires, a guardian against adultery, a servant to both pleasure and order. The brothels of Rome, or lupanaria, were hidden in plain sight. Some were crude, little more than narrow rooms with stone beds and crude graffiti etched on the walls. Others, especially those near the temples of Venus and Bacchus, were adorned with frescoes, silks, and perfumed oils. The air carried a mix of sweat and myrrh, and from behind curtains came the sounds of transaction and devotion intertwined. For the Romans, sex was not an act of shame but an exchange of energies, a reaffirmation of vitality, a gesture to the gods who governed fertility and fortune. The lupa, the she-wolf, as the prostitutes were called, occupied a strange space in Roman society. On the streets, she was a figure of ridicule and desire. In the temples, she could become something sacred. Some of these women served not only men but deities, offering their bodies during festivals and rites as living vessels of divine presence. The Romans believed that the goddess Venus herself could inhabit a woman's body during such acts, and through her touch, men might gain favor, virility, or even spiritual purification. In this sense, the transaction was no longer just physical, it was metaphysical, a bridge between mortal and divine realms. But not all who entered that world did so by choice. Many were slaves, captured in wars and sold in markets, their youth and beauty determining their value. For them, the gods were distant and silent. Their service was to men, not heaven. Yet even in the darkest brothel, symbols of piety appeared, small altars to Venus, tiny offerings of flowers and incense placed beside beds. To the Roman mind, even in debauchery there was devotion, and every act of desire carried a trace of the sacred. Roman writers recorded this paradox with fascination and disgust. Seneca condemned the brothels as dens of decay, while Ovid, with a poet's indulgence, celebrated love as divine madness. Philosophers debated whether lust corrupted the soul or cleansed it through catharsis. But among the people, the answer was simpler: sex was part of life, and life was under the rule of the gods. Even emperors embraced this truth. Augustus, while enforcing strict moral reforms, quietly maintained his own courtesans, understanding that no decree could tame desire's flame. The city's architecture itself reflected this duality. Just steps away from sacred temples stood bathhouses and pleasure dens, places where men cleansed their bodies and then surrendered them to temptation. In Pompeii, archaeologists have uncovered erotic murals not hidden in shame but displayed openly, alongside images of household gods and mythic lovers. It was as though Rome itself confessed its human nature through its art, unapologetic, immortal, and insatiable. Among the upper classes, prostitution took on a more refined form. Courtesans known as delicati entertained senators, philosophers, and generals. Their allure was not only their beauty but their intellect, their wit, their knowledge of poetry and politics. These women often moved between the worlds of power and pleasure, serving as muses, spies, and sometimes priestesses. Some aligned themselves with the cults of Venus or Fortuna, claiming divine sanction for their profession. To lie with such a woman was not a sin. It was a privilege, even a form of worship. Yet beneath the silks and scented oils was always the shadow of ownership. The Roman economy of desire was as merciless as its politics. Every embrace had its price, every glance its calculation. And still, religion lingered in the corners of this economy, an unseen partner in every transaction. When a man entered a brothel, he might whisper a prayer to Venus Cloacina, the goddess who purified filth, asking forgiveness and favor in the same breath. The divine and the depraved were entwined like lovers, inseparable and inevitable. What made this system endure was not only lust but belief. The Romans believed that the universe itself was governed by balance, chaos and order, purity and pleasure. The prostitute, in her paradoxical role, became part of that cosmic harmony. Her existence prevented greater evils, contained men's desires, and honored the fertility that sustained Rome. She was both necessary and condemned, adored in worship yet shunned in public. As the camera glides through the narrow alleys of ancient Pompeii, the lens captures inscriptions on the walls, names, prices, blessings to Venus. Each mark tells a story of survival and sanctity, of bodies turned into temples, of faith disguised as lust. Rome's hidden economy of desire was not a side story to its glory, it was its foundation, pulsing beneath its marble streets. In this world, morality was not what we think it was. The Romans did not divide life into sin and virtue but into power and purpose. Pleasure, when offered in the name of the gods, became something sacred, a ritual of renewal. And so, night after night, under the same stars that shone upon the Senate and the Colosseum, another Rome awoke, a city of women who gave their bodies to sustain the faith of a civilization that worshipped both empire and ecstasy. In the heart of the Roman world, where marble temples rose toward the heavens and incense curled like serpents of smoke, there existed a form of worship that modern minds find almost unthinkable, the cult of the sacred harlot. Here, lust was not condemned. It was canonized. The goddess Venus, radiant and merciful, demanded offerings not of gold or sacrifice, but of flesh. Her temples, glistening with ivory and polished stone, concealed a mystery that only initiates understood, that pleasure, when sanctified, could draw mortals closer to the divine. The cult of Venus Erycina was perhaps the most infamous of these sacred orders. Imported from the East and fused with Roman pragmatism, it stood on the heights of the Capitoline Hill and the slopes of Mount Eryx in Sicily, where legend claimed that Aeneas himself had once offered prayers. Within its walls, the goddess of love was not represented as the gentle muse of poetry or marriage, but as the primal force of creation, the irresistible magnet of life. Her priestesses, known as meretrices sacrae or sacred prostitutes, served her not through chastity but through surrender. Each act of union was considered an offering to Venus herself, and each coin given was not payment, but tribute, a symbol of gratitude to the goddess who governed desire. For Romans, this was not blasphemy but reverence. They believed that the divine flowed through all acts of fertility. The joining of bodies was the mirror of nature's eternal cycles, the rains fertilizing the earth, the sun warming the seed, the birth of new life from chaos. In giving themselves, the sacred women were thought to awaken that same energy, keeping Rome's spiritual and physical world in balance. The ritual act of sex became a reenactment of creation itself. To the outsider, the temple might have appeared as a house of pleasure, filled with the fragrance of myrrh, the flicker of torchlight, and the low hum of flutes. But to the devotee, it was a place of profound transformation. Men entered not as clients, but as pilgrims. They washed their hands in scented water, whispered a prayer to Venus, and left a small offering at the altar, perhaps a garland, a coin, or a piece of jewelry, before being guided to a priestess. Her body was seen as a vessel of divine energy, her embrace a channel through which the goddess's blessings flowed. Some accounts suggest that even powerful men, senators, and generals sought these encounters not for lust, but for renewal, believing that the divine essence could strengthen their fortune, virility, and destiny. Yet the paradox of purity and corruption haunted every corner of these temples. The same society that revered the Vestal virgins, women sworn to 30 years of chastity to preserve the sacred flame of Vesta, also elevated the temple prostitutes who extinguished chastity in the name of another goddess. Both were considered sacred, yet they embodied opposite forms of holiness, one through abstinence, the other through surrender. The Romans saw no contradiction in this. To them, the gods reflected the full spectrum of human nature, from restraint to indulgence, from order to chaos. To serve them, one must embody their essence completely. The cult of Flora added another dimension to this divine sensuality. During the Floralia, a festival honoring the goddess of flowers and fertility, prostitutes and courtesans were invited into the streets, their bodies adorned with blossoms and gold dust. They danced in public squares, lifting their garments in joyous abandon, cheered on by crowds who saw in them not shame, but vitality. Their laughter was believed to summon the fertility of spring, their sensuality a blessing upon the city. Even the Senate, normally the guardian of Roman order, tolerated this chaos, for to silence Flora's celebration would be to risk offending the goddess and condemning the crops to wither. In this mingling of worship and ecstasy, we see a civilization that refused to separate body from spirit. The Romans inherited from the East, from the Sumerians, Babylonians, and Phoenicians, the ancient idea that sexuality was a path to the divine. The goddess Inanna in Sumer, Ishtar in Babylon, and Astarte in Phoenicia had all demanded sacred harlots to serve in their temples, their bodies symbols of fertility and cosmic unity. Rome absorbed these traditions and gave them new form, dressing them in Latin and marble, but keeping the same heartbeat beneath. The meretrices sacrae of Venus Erycina were the final echoes of a lineage that stretched back to the dawn of civilization, women who bore the double burden of holiness and desire. But what was life truly like for these priestesses? Historical fragments, inscriptions, and poetry offer glimpses. They lived within or near the temple precincts, bound by ritual obligations but not necessarily enslaved. They adorned themselves with perfumes and jewels, not as vanity, but as devotion. Before each union, prayers were recited, invoking Venus to inhabit the body and sanctify the act. Afterward, they purified themselves in sacred baths, anointed with oils, and offered a portion of their earnings to the goddess. To the Romans, this cycle of offering and renewal was as natural as the rising and setting of the sun. Still, the boundary between sacred and profane was fragile. Not everyone saw the priestesses as divine. To many common citizens, they were little different from ordinary prostitutes, their holiness dismissed as theater. To moralists and philosophers, these rites were dangerous, a corruption of virtue disguised as faith. Even among the faithful, questions lingered. Did the goddess truly dwell in their bodies, or was this merely the invention of men who wished to sanctify their desires? Yet the temples continued to flourish, their sanctuaries glowing with candlelight deep into the night. Travelers from distant provinces came to experience their mysteries, poets wrote verses in their honor, and soldiers prayed for blessings before battle. The cult of the sacred harlot was not an aberration. It was woven into the fabric of Roman religion, standing beside sacrifices, auguries, and festivals as another means of communion with the divine. In this paradox lies Rome's brilliance and its blindness. The same empire that raised temples to virtue also built shrines to desire. It saw the human body not as sinful, but as sacred matter capable of housing the gods themselves. To touch another in reverence was to touch eternity. Yet, beneath the sacred hymns and the shimmering veils, another truth lingered, one of power, exploitation, and longing. These women were the living paradoxes of their age, worshipped as goddesses, used as tools, and remembered as neither. As the camera pans over the crumbled stones of the temple of Venus Erycina, the voice grows softer. The wind hums through the ruins like a lost hymn. Once, within these walls, men and women believed that the divine could be reached through the body, that lust could be prayer, and pleasure could open the gates of heaven. Their gods are silent now, their rituals forgotten. Yet in the lingering echo of their faith, one can still feel the pulse of something eternal, the ancient, forbidden desire to make love a pathway to the divine. Every spring, when the cold breath of winter finally lifted from the Italian hills, Rome transformed. The streets filled with the fragrance of blossoms, garlands hung from statues, and music drifted through the air. But this was not a quiet celebration of renewal, it was a riot of color, sound, and flesh. This was the Floralia, the festival of Flora, goddess of flowers, fertility, and desire. For 6 days and nights, The rigid moral order of Rome dissolved into a carnival of laughter, drunkenness, and erotic spectacle. Prostitutes, courtesans, and commoners alike became living offerings to the goddess, their bodies and joy believed to stir the earth itself into life. To the Romans, Flora was not a goddess of modest beauty but of wild abundance. Her power was in excess, in the uncontrolled flourishing of life, in color, scent, and sensation. And so her festival reflected that chaos. During Floralia, the city that normally prided itself on discipline surrendered to instinct. Theaters hosted obscene plays where actors performed naked, mocking the aristocracy and the prudish. Courtesans, usually confined to the shadows of night, danced openly in the sunlight, their hair unbound, their garments loosened. Their laughter echoed through the streets as petals rained down upon them. In this brief rebellion against restraint, lust became prayer, laughter became ritual, and Rome's most condemned women became its most sacred vessels. The origin of the festival went back centuries. It was said to have begun in 238 BCE, when the Senate, desperate to restore fertility to the land after a devastating famine, turned to the Sibylline oracles. The priestesses of the ancient prophecies commanded that Rome must honor Flora with games and offerings of joy. The logic was simple but profound. Life must be awakened not through sacrifice, but through celebration. And so began a tradition that would outlast empires. At the heart of the festival were the meretrices, the prostitutes of Rome, who became the chosen performers of Flora's rites. For most of the year, they were marginalized, scorned by matrons and mocked by poets. But during Floralia, they were the embodiment of the goddess herself. Draped in flowers and painted with perfumes, they danced before the crowds, shedding their clothes as symbols of the earth's awakening. What to us may seem scandalous was, to them, an act of faith, a ritual that symbolized the renewal of fertility and abundance. The shedding of garments represented the earth casting off the cold of winter, revealing her beauty to the sun once again. Spectators threw seeds and beans as offerings, tokens of life's renewal, while shouting blessings and obscene jokes that, paradoxically, carried sacred weight. The laughter itself was believed to please Flora, for joy was her truest sacrifice. Even the animals joined the chaos. Hares, goats, and deer, symbols of fertility, were released into the streets. Dancers wove through them, half mad with wine, and the people roared their approval. For a few nights, Rome forgot its hierarchy. The slave could mock his master, the courtesan could dance before senators, the city could revel in the divine madness of creation. But not all looked kindly upon these rites. Conservative voices like Cato the Elder called the Floralia a moral disaster, a corruption of virtue masquerading as worship. Yet the festival endured, not just because it was beloved by the people, but because it served a deeper social function. In a society obsessed with order, the Floralia provided a necessary release. It was ritualized chaos, a controlled descent into indulgence that allowed Rome to cleanse itself of hypocrisy. The goddess of flowers demanded not purity, but honesty, the acknowledgement that beneath the togas and laws, every Roman heart still burned with primal desire. The blending of the sacred and the sensual during the Floralia also reflected Rome's evolving theology. While early Roman religion had been austere, rooted in duty and discipline, the later empire embraced the emotional and ecstatic. The influence of Greek and Eastern mystery cults introduced the idea that divine union could be felt, that passion itself could open a path to transcendence. During Floralia, when courtesans danced and lovers embraced beneath the garlands, the line between human pleasure and divine blessing disappeared entirely. To make love beneath the goddess's gaze was not sin, but celebration. Still, there was tragedy beneath the laughter. Many of the women who became symbols of Flora's freedom lived lives of deep servitude. Some were slaves forced into performance, their divinity masking their exploitation. Others were free but bound by social exile, their holiness lasting only as long as the festival. When the last torch of Floralia was extinguished, they returned to the alleys and brothels, their sacredness stripped away with the petals. The same crowds who had adored them for 6 nights would avert their eyes the next morning. Such was the cruel rhythm of Rome's moral theater, a society that both worshipped and condemned the feminine, that turned women into goddesses only to remind them of their place. Yet even in its cruelty, the festival revealed a profound truth about the Roman psyche. The people did not see lust and laughter as moral decay but as divine necessity. Life depended on joy, and joy required transgression. The sacred prostitute, the courtesan of Flora, the dancing women of the temple, they were all reminders that creation begins in chaos. Rome's philosophers could debate virtue and vice endlessly, but in the streets, the people already understood. The gods of order demanded sacrifice, but the gods of life demanded pleasure. As the festival reached its climax, torches were lit, illuminating the faces of dancers smeared with gold dust. The air pulsed with drums and chanting. Couples embraced in the open, their silhouettes flickering against the walls of temples dedicated to chastity. For that brief, burning night, the empire's contradictions were laid bare: chastity and lust, sin and sanctity, priestess and prostitute, all merged into one living act of devotion. Then dawn came. The laughter faded, the petals scattered, the music died. Rome returned to its laws, its senate, its hierarchy. The streets were swept clean, but the scent of wine and flowers lingered in the air, a ghost of forbidden holiness. Somewhere, in a quiet temple corner, an offering remained, a wreath left by a woman who had danced herself into exhaustion, her faith and body spent in service to a goddess who demanded joy. In that silence, we feel the essence of Floralia, the festival where Rome remembered that the divine was not only in temples and sacrifices but in laughter, in touch, in the trembling pulse of life itself. The sacred prostitutes of Flora's festival were not merely entertainers, they were conduits of something ancient and ineffable, a memory of when humanity and the gods still spoke through desire. In the shadow of Rome's towering temples, behind walls of carved marble and golden altars, there existed a secret theology, one written not in scripture, but in flesh. The belief that the body itself could be an offering, a vessel of divine power. For the Romans, faith was not an abstract virtue. It was lived, breathed, and touched. And nowhere was this more visible than in the sacred act of giving one's body to the gods of desire. The body in this world was not only a possession but a prayer. To understand the sanctity of such a belief, one must first abandon the modern divide between the physical and the spiritual. To the Romans, they were one and the same, two reflections of a single divine force that governed existence. Every sensation, every act of pleasure or pain, was an echo of the gods' own passions. Venus loved and lusted, Mars fought and embraced, Bacchus wept and laughed in drunken ecstasy. The gods felt as humans did, and in return humans honored them by embodying their emotions. The meretrix sacra, the sacred prostitute, became the ultimate imitator of the divine. Her body was a stage upon which the cosmos performed its eternal dance of creation. When a devotee entered the temple of Venus or Fortuna Virilis, he did not approach the priestess as a man approaches a woman. He approached her as a supplicant approaches a living altar. Before the act, prayers were whispered, incense was burned, and the air shimmered with perfume and expectation. The union that followed was not considered lust but invocation, a physical ritual through which divine energy flowed. The touch of skin became a sacrament, the breath between two bodies, a hymn. Each sigh, each heartbeat, was a rhythm of worship. The man sought the favor of the goddess through the woman's embrace, believing that through her, Venus herself heard his prayer. But this sanctity was not born from purity. It was born from paradox, that the same act condemned as sinful in one context could become sacred in another. A wife was expected to be chaste, a priestess of Venus was expected to surrender. Both were seen as holy, both necessary for Rome's balance. The wife preserved the household and lineage, the sacred prostitute preserved fertility and cosmic order. In a sense, she carried the burden of humanity's unspoken desires, giving form to impulses that others had to deny. Through her, lust became purified, redirected toward the heavens. Still, beneath the incense and poetry lay a world of deep suffering. Not all women who served in temples did so freely. Many were enslaved or coerced, their supposed sanctity a mask for exploitation. The rituals that clothed them in divine purpose could also strip them of humanity. They were praised as embodiments of the goddess but denied the dignity of a person. For every noble courtesan draped in pearls, there were hundreds of nameless women whose offerings were extracted, not given. The Romans believed that the gods demanded pleasure, and so pleasure became a duty, even when it brought pain. And yet, despite the cruelty of their fate, some of these women found meaning in their role. Ancient inscriptions and poems reveal glimpses of devotion, prayers left at Venus's altar by women who saw their service not as shame but as destiny. One surviving verse from a temple near Capua reads, "Through me, the goddess breathes. Through my touch, men are reborn." Whether these words were written by a priestess or by those who worshipped her, they speak to a profound truth, that the act of love, when stripped of judgment, was considered divine communion. The belief in noumen, the divine presence that could inhabit objects, places, and people, was central to Roman religion. A tree, a river, or a statue could contain the essence of a god. So too could a human body. When a woman consecrated herself to Venus, she was believed to become temporarily infused with the goddess's power. Her body ceased to be her own. It became an instrument of divinity. The hands that touched her, the lips that kissed her, were not defiling her, they were honoring the goddess within her. It was a theology of embodiment, where holiness lived not in denial of the flesh but within it. However, this philosophy was double-edged. What was divine in theory often became destructive in practice. The idea that a woman's body could serve as a spiritual vessel gave men both reverence and power, reverence to worship her, power to possess her. Rome's temples thus became mirrors of its society, radiant in their ideals, corrupt in their reality. The goddess was honored, but her daughters suffered. The sacred prostitute became both symbol and scapegoat, adored for her divinity, despised for her humanity. The rituals themselves were complex, blending physicality with mysticism. Before each offering, the priestess would bathe in perfumed oils, adorn herself with gold, and pray for Venus to descend. Sometimes she wore a veil to signify her dual nature, mortal and divine. The act itself took place not in shadow but in the glow of lamplight, accompanied by music and whispered prayers. Some accounts describe attendants collecting drops of oil or sweat to mix with incense, believing these carried traces of the goddess's essence. Afterward, both participants would purify themselves in sacred water, leaving coins or flowers at the altar. The transaction was complete, not of commerce, but of cosmic exchange. This ritualization of the flesh reveals much about Rome's understanding of spirituality. Unlike later Christian thought, which divided body and soul, Rome saw them as one continuous current. To feed the body was to nourish the spirit. To deny desire entirely was to reject part of the divine design. The sacred prostitute embodied this philosophy. She was the living reconciliation of opposites, sin and salvation, pleasure and piety. Through her, Rome's people found a way to make peace with their own contradictions. And yet, as centuries passed, this theology began to rot from within. The same empire that had sanctified lust grew increasingly moralistic, especially as Stoic philosophy and Eastern asceticism spread. Sex was gradually reinterpreted as weakness, and the temple courtesan became a scandal instead of a priestess. Still, for generations, the idea endured, the belief that through the body, one could touch the divine. Imagine the temple at night. The air heavy with incense, the faint sound of lyres echoing through marble corridors. A woman kneels before the statue of Venus, her face illuminated by flickering light. She whispers a prayer, not for forgiveness, but for strength. She knows her name will never be written among Rome's heroes or saints. Yet she believes, with every breath, that her service sustains the balance between heaven and earth. That in her surrender, the goddess smiles. In the end, the body as offering was not simply an act of lust. It was a mirror held up to humanity's eternal longing, to merge, to dissolve, to become one with something greater. For the Romans, that longing had a face, a name, and a temple. And through it, they revealed a truth that still lingers in the human heart, that the divine is not always found in purity, but in passion, not in denial of the flesh, but in its sacred fire. As the empire expanded, Rome absorbed not just the lands it conquered but the gods, rituals, and taboos of countless cultures. The sacred prostitutes who once served Venus were no longer alone in their divine profession. They were joined by priestesses of Cybele, of Isis, of Baal and Astarte, foreign deities of fertility, frenzy, and forbidden pleasure. The Roman temples began to echo with the songs of many tongues, the mingling of Eastern mystery and Western ritual. Yet beneath this harmony was a slow and dangerous transformation, one that blurred the lines between holiness and heresy, between devotion and indulgence. In the early centuries of the empire, as Rome's wealth and decadence reached their zenith, the gods of lust were not merely worshipped, they were entertained. The cult of Venus Genetrix in particular evolved into a spectacle, where sacred rites began to take on the character of theater. Ritual acts once whispered in the shadows of marble altars were now performed in open courtyards, witnessed by the curious and the faithful alike. The line between ceremony and performance dissolved, and what had once been an act of intimate communion became a public affirmation of power. At the same time, the Eastern cults brought a new intensity to Rome's spiritual landscape. The rites of Cybele, the Great Mother, introduced an element of ecstatic madness. Her priests, known as the Galli, were eunuchs who had castrated themselves in devotion to the goddess, symbolizing the annihilation of earthly desire in pursuit of divine love. Yet paradoxically, her worship was filled with wild dancing, drumming, and sexual symbolism. The devotees would whip themselves into trances, their bodies shaking, their minds overtaken by divine frenzy. For them, pain was not punishment, it was purification. In the temples of Isis, the Egyptian goddess of rebirth and magic, the rituals carried an air of mystery and seduction. Priestesses dressed in linen and gold invoked her name with songs that promised transcendence through surrender. The faithful believed that through acts of sacred union, they could partake in the eternal cycles of death and rebirth that Isis embodied. Roman men and women, drawn by both the allure of exotic mysticism and the promise of spiritual renewal, found in her temples a form of salvation that was both sensual and transcendent. These new religions reshaped the meaning of sacred sexuality in Rome. Where once the act had symbolized communion with a single goddess of love, it now represented something broader, the eternal cycle of life and death, creation and destruction. The body was not just a vessel of pleasure, it was the bridge between mortality and immortality. Every touch, every sigh, every moment of surrender carried echoes of the gods' own passions, their eternal dance of union and separation. But this spiritual evolution also gave birth to corruption. As the empire's moral fabric began to fray, the temples themselves became reflections of its decay. The wealthy elite began to use religious rituals as a disguise for indulgence. What had been sacred became spectacle, what had been faith became theater. Lavish feasts were held in honor of Venus, where senators and courtesans mingled, their devotion mingled with decadence. Offerings of perfume and flowers were replaced with gold and flesh. The temple became less a place of worship and more a stage for power and desire. Yet amidst the corruption, there were still those who believed. The rural sanctuaries, far from the politics of the city, preserved fragments of the old purity. In small towns and coastal shrines, women continued to serve as living vessels of the goddess, their rituals humble but heartfelt. They prayed not for wealth or favor, but for fertility, health, and divine balance. For them, the sacred act remained what it had always been, an offering to life itself. The Romans called these moments mysteria, the mysteries, rites that could not be spoken of, only experienced. To participate was to step outside the boundaries of the ordinary, to enter a realm where gods and mortals became one. The participants were often sworn to secrecy, and to break that oath was to invite divine wrath. In these hidden chambers, the air thick with incense and the low hum of chants, worshippers believed they could glimpse eternity. Some claimed to see visions, the goddess herself appearing in a blinding glow, her voice echoing through the temple halls. Whether real or imagined, these visions reinforced the power of the sacred body, both the giver and the receiver transformed in the moment of union. However, with the coming of new philosophies, Stoicism, Neoplatonism, and eventually Christianity, the perception of the body began to change. The flesh, once seen as divine material, became suspect. Desire was reinterpreted as weakness, and pleasure as sin. The sacred prostitute, once honored as the living link between mortals and the gods, became a symbol of corruption. Statues of Venus were defaced, temples closed or converted. What had been divine offering was now branded moral decay. The old ways retreated into the margins, whispered about, hidden, forbidden. But ideas do not die easily. Even as the empire fell, echoes of these ancient rites survived. In secret cults, in erotic art, in the poetry of those who remembered a time when love itself was worship. The Christian Church, despite its condemnation, could not erase the fascination with sacred desire. In its monasteries and cathedrals, one can still find carvings and frescoes that blend spiritual ecstasy with the language of passion. The yearning that once led Romans to the temples of Venus now found new expression in the visions of saints and mystics, their raptures described in terms that border on the erotic. The legacy of Rome's sacred prostitutes, then, is not one of mere lust or depravity. It is the story of how humanity has always sought the divine through the flesh, how, across ages and empires, the boundary between sacred and profane has never been fixed. In the temples of Venus, Isis, and Cybele, people confronted the deepest truths of existence, that pleasure and pain, purity and corruption, life and death, are all entwined in the same eternal dance. And perhaps that is why their story still haunts us. Because in their devotion, whether sincere or coerced, divine or desperate, they revealed something universal, that the search for meaning often begins in the most forbidden places. The Romans believed that through desire, the gods spoke. And though their temples have long turned to dust, that whisper still lingers, in our art, our myths, and our hidden longings. The sacred body, once offered to the gods of lust, remains an eternal symbol of the human soul reaching beyond itself, yearning for the touch of something immortal. The story of Rome's sacred offerings, of bodies turned into vessels of devotion, cannot be understood without confronting the gods themselves. For in every act of ritual lust, in every whispered prayer and trembling embrace, it was not merely men and women at play, but the gods of desire, invisible yet ever-present, shaping the fate of those who dared to worship through flesh. The Romans lived within a spiritual ecosystem of passion and power, where the divine was not distant or benevolent but hungry, restless, and dangerously human. Among all these deities, none embodied the seductive terror of desire more vividly than Venus, the mother of love and lust, the goddess whose beauty could topple empires. Yet Venus was not alone. Around her swirled a pantheon of beings who personified every shade of human appetite, from gentle longing to devouring madness. Cupid, her winged son, was not merely a playful cherub but a divine force capable of enslaving the heart and mind. Priapus, the grotesque fertility god, stood as the crude, laughing reminder that creation itself was rooted in obscene power. Bacchus, or Dionysus to the Greeks, brought intoxication, ecstasy, and the loss of control that both liberated and destroyed. These gods did not demand prayers of restraint, they demanded surrender. In the mythology of these deities, one finds the reflection of Rome's own contradictions, a civilization that preached discipline but worshipped excess, that glorified chastity yet celebrated orgy in its festivals. To understand the sacred prostitute was to understand this theology of contradiction. She did not serve a single god, but an entire constellation of divine impulses, each representing a fragment of human nature sanctified by myth. The worship of Venus was sensual and tender, her rites perfumed and adorned with garlands of roses. The air in her temples shimmered with music and soft laughter, her priestesses moving like living symbols of grace. But the rites of Bacchus were the opposite, wild, ecstatic, and uncontrollable. In the Bacchanalia, the participants drank wine until their senses dissolved, dancing and crying out in frenzy. It was said that in these moments, Bacchus himself entered their bodies, making them instruments of his divine madness. For a few hours, mortals became gods, freed from the chains of identity, shame, and reason. The state tried to suppress these rites more than once, fearing their power to unleash chaos. The Senate famously outlawed the Bacchanalia in 186 BCE, calling them a threat to order and morality. Yet even after the ban, they continued in secret, their participants whispering their prayers beneath the moon, hidden in caves or forest glades. Such was the allure of forbidden ecstasy. Once tasted, it could not be forgotten. The goddess Cybele, imported from Phrygia, offered yet another form of divine madness. Her priests, the Galli, were men who renounced their masculinity by self-castration, an act both horrifying and holy. In their blood and suffering, they believed they touched the goddess's power. Their ceremonies, filled with drums, flutes, and frenzied dances, were said to blur the boundary between agony and bliss. The Romans, who prided themselves on rationality, looked upon these rites with fascination and horror. But beneath their disgust lay envy, for the Galli had dared to transcend what it meant to be human, embracing pain as a path to transcendence. This paradox, that pleasure and pain, desire and sacrifice, could coexist as sacred forces, defined the Roman understanding of the gods of lust. They were not moral beings, they were elemental. To worship them was to risk one's sanity, to court both divine favor and destruction. And in this dance of devotion, the sacred prostitute played the most dangerous role of all. She became the mediator between mortals and these volatile deities, her body the battlefield upon which the gods' passions were reenacted. Roman poets, especially Ovid, captured this divine ambiguity in their verses. In Ars Amatoria, Ovid described love not as virtue but as warfare, and lovers as soldiers under Venus's command. He taught the art of seduction as a sacred skill, an echo of the ancient rites. To love, he implied, was to serve the goddess, to be wounded by her arrow and to bleed willingly. Yet beneath the wit and elegance of his words lies something darker, the awareness that desire is both creative and destructive, both holy and ruinous. For the Romans, these divine contradictions were not abstract. They lived them in their festivals, in their marriages, in their fears. Every act of passion carried the potential for both blessing and curse. A man could be blessed with fertility or struck mad by obsession. A woman could gain divine favor or be consumed by the goddess's jealousy. The gods of lust were not merciful. They were mirrors, reflecting back the truth of human desire in its rawest form. The temple courtesans understood this more than anyone. In their service, they saw the faces of countless men, noblemen, soldiers, priests, each seeking not merely pleasure but absolution. Some came in loneliness, others in guilt. Some offered gifts of gold, others tears. And in each encounter, the sacred prostitute had to become both lover and confessor, both mortal and divine. She knew the gods she served were not kind, but she also knew that in their cruelty lay meaning. To touch the divine was to risk annihilation, yet to avoid it was to live without purpose. In many ways, the sacred prostitute's role was a living enactment of myth. When she embraced a man in the name of Venus, she was not herself, she became the goddess's vessel. When she whispered words of comfort or passion, she spoke as if channeling a divine voice. And when the act was done and the man departed, she was left emptied, a mortal again, bearing the weight of a divinity that never fully left her. The emotional toll of this cycle must have been immense. Ancient writings hint at priestesses who suffered visions, dreams, and madness, consumed by the intensity of their devotion. To serve the gods of lust was to live on the edge between ecstasy and despair. Over time, the Romans began to sense the danger in their own gods. The same forces that had once fueled the empire's vitality began to corrode it from within. The excess, the indulgence, the worship of pleasure, these became signs of decline. The gods of lust, once revered, became demons in the Christian imagination. Venus turned into the symbol of temptation. Bacchus became the spirit of sin. But even as their names were cursed, their essence endured. The fire they kindled could not be extinguished, it merely changed form. Even in the later centuries, when Christianity rose and pagan temples fell, the psychological legacy of these gods remained. The saints and mystics of the new faith spoke of divine love in language that was startlingly similar to the ecstasies of the old cults. Saint Teresa of Avila, centuries later, would describe her union with God as a piercing sweetness, her heart consumed by a burning arrow of love, imagery that could have belonged as easily to Venus or Cupid. The pagan gods of lust had not died, they had simply been baptized. Thus, the gods of desire, Venus, Bacchus, Cybele, Priapus, continue to haunt the corridors of Western thought. They remind us that the longing for the divine and the craving for touch are not separate instincts but twin flames of the same fire. Rome understood this, even if it destroyed itself in the process. Its sacred prostitutes, its wild festivals, its forbidden rites, all were expressions of humanity's eternal yearning to reach the divine through the senses, to find eternity in a fleeting embrace. In the end, the gods of lust were not monsters or angels. They were reflections of humanity's endless hunger for meaning, power, and love. The Romans, in worshipping them, revealed the deepest truth of all, that divinity is not found in purity, but in passion. That the road to the sacred often winds through the forbidden. And that in every heart that dares to desire, the old gods still whisper, calling us back to the temple of flesh where heaven and earth once touched. Rome was a city of paradoxes, where the glories of civilization rested atop layers of shadow and transgression. Its streets were paved with marble, yet beneath them flowed rivers of desire and exploitation. Its temples reached for the heavens, yet inside, mortal flesh became the altar. The sacred prostitutes, once revered as intermediaries between gods and men, embodied this contradiction. They were adored, feared, and often destroyed by the very society that claimed to honor them. In them, the empire's beauty and cruelty coexisted, a living testament to the intoxicating, terrifying duality of human nature. As the empire matured, this duality intensified. The same men who kneeled before Venus and whispered prayers of longing also manipulated, enslaved, and objectified those they claimed were sacred. Power and lust became inseparable, and the sacred prostitute became both instrument and victim. Their bodies were conduits for divine energy, yes, but also mirrors reflecting the moral fragility of a civilization obsessed with control and indulgence. Each ritual, festival, or temple encounter revealed a harsh truth. The gods' demands were inexorable, and humanity was always at the mercy of forces larger than itself. This cruelty was not always violent in the physical sense. It was often woven into the very structure of society. Temple prostitutes were regulated, their lives constrained by law, custom, and ritual. Their freedom existed only within the boundaries dictated by the gods and their human overseers. They were allowed to touch divinity, but only in ways prescribed by culture, and the moment they stepped outside the sacred context, they were condemned. They were immortalized in myth but denied personal legacy. Their service was essential for the city's spiritual and social balance, yet it came at the cost of autonomy, privacy, and often, dignity. The moral tension extended beyond the temples and streets into the minds of those who participated. Romans believed that desire itself could be divine, but it also carried the potential for ruin. Lust could bless, but it could also destroy. In this way, the sacred prostitute became a living embodiment of Rome's psychological paradox. Men approached her seeking connection to the divine, but often encountered a reflection of their own vulnerability, greed, or obsession. Women who served in temples were forced to navigate this emotional minefield, balancing devotion with survival, holiness with exploitation. The line between sanctity and suffering was razor thin, and crossing it could mean madness, shame, or death. History reveals this tension vividly. Temples of Venus Erycina and other cults were sites of celebration, ecstasy, and ritualized joy. Yet inscriptions, graffiti, and literary accounts hint at darker realities. Priestesses coerced into service, victims of envy and manipulation, and devotees whose worship blurred into obsession. Roman morality was a complex tapestry, one that both venerated and punished desire. In every act of devotion lay the shadow of exploitation, a reminder that the pursuit of the divine is rarely pure, and that human systems of worship are inevitably intertwined with control, hierarchy, and violence. Even within the most intimate rituals, the potential for psychological harm was immense. The sacred prostitute was expected to inhabit the divine fully while simultaneously managing the very human expectations of men who came to her for ecstasy, blessing, or absolution. This required a constant negotiation of self, body, and spirit. The act of sacred union demanded a performance of divinity, a total surrender to another's desires, and an endurance of their judgment. The emotional labor was immense, often leaving the priestess both elevated and exhausted, her identity constantly oscillating between human and divine. Yet within this tension, there existed an undeniable power. The sacred prostitute wielded influence that few citizens, senators, or generals could match. She could inspire awe, manipulate favor, and enact subtle control over those who sought the gods through her. In this, we see the complex psychology of sacred sexuality. It was both a weapon and a blessing, a burden and a privilege. Women who understood the rituals, the gods' temperaments, and human nature could navigate a delicate balance, extracting power from the very structures designed to constrain them. This interplay between devotion and danger, pleasure and pain, sanctity and exploitation, formed the core of Rome's moral paradox. The sacred prostitute existed at the threshold of human understanding, embodying the empire's fascination with extremes. She was a reminder that holiness is not always gentle, that worship is not always serene, and that the pursuit of divinity often requires a confrontation with the darkest aspects of human desire. In many ways, this is the psychological heart of Rome itself. The empire thrived on dualities, law and chaos, civilization and indulgence, honor and cruelty. Its sacred prostitutes were microcosms of these contradictions, living testaments to the uneasy harmony between creation and destruction. They were worshipped and used, adored and discarded, elevated and silenced, their very existence a mirror to the empire's soul. By examining their lives, we gain insight into the broader human condition. Desire is powerful. It can inspire reverence, devotion, and creativity. But it can also enslave, corrupt, and destroy. In the temples of Rome, where pleasure became ritual and the human body became divine, we see both the possibility of transcendence and the inevitability of suffering. The sacred prostitute story is not simply one of sin or salvation. It is a profound lesson in the complexity of devotion, the fragility of morality, and the enduring tension between ecstasy and exploitation. As the empire eventually declined, the physical temples crumbled, but the psychological imprint endured. Their stories, of holiness intertwined with pain, of desire sanctified yet constrained, echo across centuries. They remind us that the pursuit of the divine is rarely straightforward, that our instincts and our ideals are often at odds, and that humanity has always sought transcendence in the most forbidden of places. In the end, the legacy of Rome's sacred prostitutes is not just one of scandal or spectacle, but of a civilization confronting the deepest truths of desire, morality, and power, truths that continue to haunt us, demanding both fascination and reflection. The ruins of Rome whisper of a civilization where divinity and desire were inseparably entwined. Marble temples and crumbling statues bear silent witness to the rituals that once transformed flesh into a vessel of worship. The sacred prostitutes, though marginalized by history, with a living bridge between mortal and divine, their bodies both tools and sacrifices, their lives a reflection of Rome's grandeur and its contradictions. In them, we see the extremes of human devotion, the capacity for reverence, the lure of pleasure, and the cost of serving forces beyond comprehension. As Christianity rose and pagan practices were outlawed, the sacred prostitutes were pushed to the shadows, their rituals condemned as sinful. Yet the psychological imprint of these rites endured. Humanity's fascination with desire as a path to transcendence did not vanish, it simply transformed. In secret cults, in art, and in literature, echoes of Venus, Bacchus, and Cybele persisted, testifying to a timeless impulse, to touch the sacred through the body, to find the eternal in the ephemeral. The sacred prostitute embodied a dangerous paradox. She wielded influence, guiding men toward divine experience, yet her autonomy was circumscribed by law, ritual, and social hierarchy. Her life was one of devotion and exploitation, ecstasy and exhaustion, holiness and vulnerability. In performing sacred acts, she mirrored Rome itself, a civilization obsessed with control, indulgence, and spectacle, yet unable to escape the moral and psychological consequences of its own desires. Yet even within this danger lay power. Through her rituals, the priestess navigated the delicate boundary between pleasure and devotion, turning acts of intimacy into conduits of divine energy. She revealed a fundamental truth about human nature, that the pursuit of transcendence often demands courage, vulnerability, and confrontation with the forbidden. Desire, when sanctified, becomes more than instinct. It becomes ritual, prayer, and mirror of the cosmos. The legacy of these women endures in the way humanity continues to grapple with desire, morality, and devotion. They remind us that holiness is not always found in restraint, that pleasure can be sacred, and that the human longing for connection, to each other, and to something beyond ourselves, is eternal. Even as temples crumble and gods fade, the story of Rome's sacred prostitutes remains a haunting testament to the complexity of human nature, a reminder that in the pursuit of the divine, we are forever drawn to the forbidden.